In today's murder case, we're going to delve into the real story that took place in the 1980s. It was originally an unsolved mystery, but after nearly 30 years, the case has been solved finally under persistent investigations. Our protagonist today is named Karin Strom. At 25 years old, Karin was outgoing and well-liked by her friends. She lived in Woods Cross, a city in Davis County, Utah. Growing up with her father, she met Steve Strom during high school. The two fell in love at first sight and were married shortly after graduating. As with many newlyweds, they enjoyed a sweet life together. However, as time went on, their happiness began to fade and cracks appeared in their relationship. After 3 or 4 years of marriage, Karin could no longer bear this life and decided to separate and move in with her stepmother. But soon, tragedy struck Karin. How did Karin meet her unfortunate fate? Let's go back to June 5th, 1980. On this Thursday, Steve called Karin a few days earlier, saying that he wanted to pick her up and have dinner together. Since it was Karin's birthday and their wedding anniversary was coming up, Karin agreed to Steve's request. They had dinner together that evening and returned home afterward. Steve worked the night shift at a factory near the Great Salt Lake from 12:30 a.m. to 7 a.m. After resting at home for a while, Steve left for work, leaving Karin at home for the night. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Steve finished work and called home to remind Karin to get up for work, but no one answered the phone. He called several more times, but still no answer. Steve became worried because Karin should have been available to answer the phone at this time. Concerned for Karin's safety, he immediately clocked out and rushed home. Upon returning home, Steve first checked the kitchen to see if Karin had left a note about her whereabouts, but found nothing. He then went to the bedroom, pushed open the door, and was shocked by the scene before him. Karin was lying on the floor, face up, with blood on her neck. Terrified, Steve immediately called the police. The police arrived shortly after, but it was too late. Karin had already passed away. Investigators quickly began examining the scene. Karin was wearing her pajamas, lying face up on the floor with her feet against the wall and her head near the corner of the bed. There were clear strangulation marks on her throat, as well as scratches on her neck and arms. The blanket and sheets had fallen off the bed, and the pillow had been thrown to the floor. The TV had fallen from a nearby cabinet, still plugged in and illuminated. The copper bed frame had 2 bars knocked off, one of which was completely on the floor. The police determined that a violent struggle had taken place in the room. Apart from the bedroom, there was no damage to the rest of the house. Karin's back door was a sliding door, secured by a stick that prevented entry from the outside. The front door lock was intact, and the windows were undamaged. Police speculated that either Karin had let the killer into the house herself, or the killer had a key. After entering the house, the killer engaged in a fierce struggle with Karin. The wounds on her arms showed that she had fought back. The killer presumably strangled Karin with both hands, ultimately causing her death. The police initially suspected that the crime was committed by someone familiar with Karin. Investigators began questioning Karin's relatives and friends. Some mentioned that Karin and Steve had recently experienced some relationship troubles. Steve admitted that their marriage had faced some issues, and they had been living separately for some time. During this period, Karin was staying at her stepmother's house, but they were recently trying to reconcile. On the night of the incident, Steve had invited Karin to have dinner together, and their relationship had significantly improved. Steve's statement was partially confirmed by Karin's stepmother. The stepmother confirmed that Karin had agreed to have dinner with Steve that day, but the couple wasn't trying to reconcile. She also revealed that Karin had mentioned her plans to divorce Steve, making her realize that their marriage was beyond repair. Because of that, she advised Karin not to go to the dinner. Karin insisted that it was just a meal and wouldn't affect her decision to divorce. She thought it would be an opportunity to bring up the divorce with Steve. After listening to the stepmother's testimony, investigators believed Steve's motive for committing the crime had significantly increased, so they questioned him again. This round of questioning took the police by surprise. Steve claimed he knew who the killer was. It was Karin's new boyfriend, Buff. Steve knew that Karin had been seeing Buff after they separated. She would often confide in Buff when she felt down. Buff might have been jealous of their potential reconciliation, leading him to kill Karin in a fit of anger. The police immediately brought in Buff for questioning. Buff cooperated fully with the investigation and insisted that he had nothing to do with Karin's death. He admitted to loving Karin deeply, and she loved him too. They were very happy together. He wanted Karin to do what she enjoyed, so he once suggested that she give Steve another chance. On the other hand, Karin's relatives and friends believed that her relationship with Steve wasn't good, but she was always smiling when she was with Buff. They claimed that Buff wouldn't hurt Karin and that the jealous person was more likely to be Steve, not Buff. Also, Buff had an alibi for the night of the crime, so the police ruled him out as a suspect. By this point in the investigation, the coroner's autopsy report had also been completed. Due to the limitations of the technology at the time, the coroner could not determine a specific time of death. They could only estimate it based on the degree of digestion of the food in the victim's stomach and the time of ingestion. The coroner estimated that Karin died between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. the following morning. Steve's shift at work that night began at 12:30 a.m., but he seemed to be late that day. He clocked in at 12:45 a.m., and it took 25-30 minutes to travel from his home to the factory, which wasn't too far away. Considering the estimated time frame of Karin's death, Steve could have committed the crime before going to work and then proceeded to the factory. Steve's colleagues said that he behaved normally that night, showing no signs of panic, nervousness, or unusual behavior. At this point, Steve provided the police with another person of interest, his co-worker, Edward Owens. Steve and Owens often drank, hunted, and fished together, and they were very good friends. Steve told the police that his friend Owens was suspicious. Owens worked at the same place as Steve, with Steve working the night shift and Owens the afternoon shift, so Owens had time to commit the crime. The police brought in Owens and indeed made a discovery. Owens had numerous small wounds on his arms and face that looked like scratch marks. However, Owens explained that these injuries were accidentally caused by metal shavings at work. The factory manager confirmed that it was common for metal shavings to fly out while working on machines, and getting scratched was normal. As for the injuries on his face, he had accidentally hit his head on a piece of equipment while bending down to pick up something that day. On the night of the incident, Owens went to a bar with some co-workers after work and played pool for a while. They drank from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m. the next morning. Owens claimed that he returned to the factory around 4:30 a.m., providing an alibi. The co-workers who went to the bar with Owens that day confirmed this story. Upon investigation, Owens had little connection to Karin, and their paths rarely crossed in their daily lives. The police couldn't find any significant motive for Owens, so they ruled him out as a suspect. As part of the investigation procedure, Owens's DNA and hair samples were collected and preserved, and photos of his wounds were taken. At this point, both suspects provided by Steve had been ruled out, so the police had reason to believe that Steve was lying. He had inconsistent statements and a strong motive to commit the crime. Furthermore, Steve didn't have an alibi. Theoretically, he could have committed the crime during the time frame of Karin's death before starting his shift. Subsequently, the county prosecutor issued an arrest warrant, and Steve was charged with first-degree murder. It seems that the prosecution was confident in winning the case. However, all the evidence related to the case was presented in court, but all of it was circumstantial, and there was no solid, incriminating evidence. In December 1980, the verdict was announced. The court ruled that the first-degree murder charge against Steve was not proven, and he was released on the spot. Karin's family was disappointed with the outcome. With the court's decision, the case suddenly went cold and became an unsolved mystery. However, Karin's sister, Coco, never gave up and continued to search for evidence. She made finding the killer her primary goal in life, hoping that one day the truth would be revealed. The year is 2006, 26 years after the incident occurred. Karin's sister, Coco, visits the police station to inquire about the progress of her sister's case. Over the past 26 years, she has visited the police station periodically, and each time the police have told her that there are no new leads. In fact, the police had almost given up on this cold case. However, a detective named Brad Benson becomes moved by Coco's persistence and decides to look into the case. After some time researching the 26-year-old cold case, Benson requests permission from his superiors to reopen the investigation. Coco seeks out Detective Benson, and together, they work to find new evidence. The request is approved, and the case is officially reopened in January 2007. Detective Benson reviews all the physical evidence from the original investigation. He comes across Karin's fingernails and believes they may contain the killer's DNA. Since DNA technology was not used in criminal investigations at the time of the crime, Karin's fingernails were never tested for DNA. Detective Benson sends the fingernails to a laboratory for DNA testing. While waiting for the test results, Benson calls one of the original suspects, Owens. Upon answering the call, Benson introduces himself and explains that he is reinvestigating Karin's case, asking Owens to answer some questions. Owens becomes extremely uneasy, his voice trembling and evading many of Benson's questions, leading Benson to suspect that Owens may know something about the case. The DNA test results confirm Benson's suspicion. Karin's fingernails contain DNA from both Owens and Steve. Benson then requests a forensic reassessment of Karin's time of death. Using more advanced technology and taking into account the temperature changes, the medical examiner determines that Karin died around 12:30 a.m. During that time, Steve clocked in at work at 12:45 a.m., and the commute from his home to the factory takes at least 25 minutes. This makes it virtually impossible for Steve to be the culprit. Owens, on the other hand, also had an alibi. He was at a bar drinking with colleagues from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. So why was Owens' DNA found under Karin's fingernails? Detective Benson interviews the co-workers who were drinking with Owens that night. They recall that Owens was indeed at the bar with them, drinking and playing pool, but they could not confirm that he was there the entire time. It was possible for Owens to have left the bar and returned without anyone noticing. Benson reviews the photographs of Owens' injuries from 1980, and the wounds appear more consistent with scratches rather than machinery-caused injuries. The police now consider Owens as the prime suspect and want to bring him in for questioning. However, they are one step too late. Owens leaves a farewell letter for his wife, stating that he will never return. Owens becomes a fugitive from justice. His credit card records show that he fled to San Antonio, Texas, and then to Mexico, plunging the case back into uncertainty. In March 2007, the case took another turn. The police received a tip that Owens had run out of money and could no longer live in Mexico, so he had to return to the United States. Upon hearing this news, Detective Benson immediately called Owens and informed him that he had enough evidence to apply for an arrest warrant and urged him to turn himself in. With nowhere left to run, Owens surrendered at the police station. He would face charges of first-degree murder. During his arrest, another case involving Owens also surfaced. In 1972, on Hermosa Beach in California, a woman named Kimberly was walking on the beach when Owens attacked her. He beat her and tried to strangle her with his hands. Kimberly fought back and managed to escape. She reported the incident to the police, who arrested Owens. He was tried in California, and although Kimberly identified Owens as her attacker in court, his family provided an alibi for him. Owens was acquitted and the case was dismissed. However, Owens's family did not give up on his defense. They hired a prominent lawyer to represent him. The lawyer immediately raised a critical issue. The DNA on Karin's fingernails was not from skin cells, but from semen, suggesting that this was not a murder case, but rather an attempted sexual assault. As for why Owens fled to Mexico, his lawyer claimed that he went to Texas to visit a friend, and then to a town near the Mexican border. It was only after spending some time there that he learned he might be facing a murder charge in Utah, so he returned to the United States, not because he had run out of money. Due to insufficient evidence, the prosecution dropped the charges against Owens and he was released once again. Detective Benson repeatedly reviewed all the physical evidence from 1980, hoping to find even the slightest piece of compelling evidence within the items. The police took photographs of the evidence, and after running them through a computer, the images were digitally processed. This allowed them to examine every minute detail without overlooking anything. Thanks to Detective Benson's tireless efforts, he eventually discovered an almost invisible tiny red dot on one of Karin's garments. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a drop of blood. Could this blood drop convict Owens? Detective Benson immediately contacted the laboratory to examine the sample for any DNA evidence. The blood drop was decades old, and the sample was incredibly small, making testing extremely difficult. A few days later, the results revealed that the blood belonged to Owens. With such compelling evidence, the police reopened the case against Owens in March 2009. In court, faced with the mounting evidence, Owens finally admitted his guilt. On May 21, 2009, the day of Owens' sentencing hearing, the case took another unexpected turn. Owens made a shocking confession that left everyone in disbelief. He claimed that although he killed Karin, the mastermind behind the crime was Steve. Owens said that Steve had approached him several months prior with the idea, but he initially refused. Later, Steve purchased a life insurance policy for his wife, Karin. If she were to have an accident, Steve would receive a substantial payout. Steve promised Owens half of the insurance money if he carried out the deed. Steve gave Owens a key to the room, and on June 6, 1980, Owens used the key to enter the house in the early morning hours. Instead of attacking Karin immediately, he tried to warn her to leave and told her that Steve wanted her dead, urging her to flee and never return. But Karin did not believe him and angrily ordered him to leave, leading to a confrontation that ended with Owens strangling her to death. At the hearing, Steve naturally denied everything Owens claimed. After an investigation, the police confirmed that Steve had indeed purchased an insurance policy for his wife. The policy was a factory benefit worth $50,000. But no evidence linked the policy to Karin's case, so no charges were brought against Steve. However, if anyone were to present new evidence connecting Steve to the crime, he could still be prosecuted. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Owens guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The case spanned a total of 29 years from its occurrence to its conclusion. Without Detective Benson's decision to reopen the investigation, it would have remained an unsolved mystery. Unfortunately, even with the case solved, we still do not know if Owens' claims were true. Was Steve the mastermind behind the crime? After the case ended, a journalist interviewed Karin's sister, Coco. Over the phone, Coco told the reporter that she knows the man who physically killed her sister is now in jail, and he's the one who did it. As for whether Steve was the mastermind, a phrase on Karin's tombstone reads, "Only God knows."